Wow, are we really going to review the M4 MacBook Air versus the M4 MacBook Pro? For all these years, the answer on whether a MacBook Air is better choice than a MacBook Pro has always been really simple. No. Apple's Pro laptops have always specifically been for Pro users who typically do more processor-intensive tasks, and hence the Pro models have been thicker and heavier, but they've also come with a more capable processor with a fan to boost the cooling inside and keep the processor running at top speed, and also a better screen and more ports, and the list goes on and on. In short, they've always justified their higher price. But this year, Apple launched the M4 MacBook Air, which is completely in a different league. It's so good that suddenly people have started to ask, is the M4 MacBook Air so good that it may not be worth getting a Pro? And look, let's be clear, for the super high-end Pro users who won't compromise on the budget, when buying a laptop, they will and they should go for the Pro or the Mac Mini. But if you're a semi-Pro user who's going to be really stretching to fork out the $1,600 or pounds or 1.7 lakh rupees for the entry-level M4 MacBook Pro, then wait! Because this video might just save you $600. In this review, I won't just throw specs and technical jargon at you, but I'll really try to identify the big differences between the Air and the Pro and then trade them off versus that massive $600 price difference so that we can figure out which one is right for you and your hard-earned money. So let's first try and cut the clutter a bit and go through a bit of a quick overview or a TLDR. The M4 MacBook Air released in March 2025 and it starts at $999, pounds, euros, or about 1.7 lakh rupees in India. Now by contrast, the M4 MacBook Pro was launched in 2024 and it starts at about $1,600 in the US, the UK, Europe, and about 1.7 lakh rupees in India. Now that means there's this huge $600 or 70,000 rupee difference between these two laptops. So what are the big differences that justify this price? If I really step back, I think there's 8 things that you need to know about. First, there's the processor, the M4 chip, which is the same chip family in both the Pro and the Air, but the Pro comes with 10 cores in the CPU and 10 cores in the GPU, but in the Air you get 10 CPU and 8 GPU cores. And you need to kick in another 200 in the Air to get the 10 core GPU version. Now second is the screen, where the M4 Air has the 60Hz IPS screen with the 500 nits of brightness, while the Pro has the much brighter 1000 nits, 120Hz OLED screen that can push up to 1600 nits when you're watching HDR content. Third, there's the ports, where the M4 MacBook Air gets 2 Thunderbolt 4 USB-C ports and an audio jack, whilst the M4 MacBook Pro adds a third Thunderbolt port, also an SD card reader and an HDMI slot. Fourth is the battery, where the M4 MacBook Air is rated at 18 hours versus the Pro at 22 plus hours. Fifth are the dimensions of the device, where the M4 MacBook Air is ultra portable and light at about 1.2 kgs or about 2.7 pounds, but the M4 MacBook Pro is way thicker and heavier at 1.5 kgs or 3.4 pounds. And oh, the M4 MacBook Air also has a 14-inch screen versus the 13-inch on the Air. Sixth is the speakers, where the M4 MacBook Pro has a hi-fi 6-speaker system with better bass performance, and the speakers sit on either side of the keyboard, while the Air has the 4-speaker system, but it's hidden under the screen. Seventh is the storage, where the M4 MacBook Pro starts at 512 GBs of storage, whilst the M4 MacBook Air starts at 256, and you need to add another 200 to get the 512. And finally, 8 is the charger, where you get the 70-watt fast charger in the box with the M4 Pro, but you get a 30-watt charger in the box with the M4 Air. So there you go. 8 big differences. Now look, budget MacBook users who are just mostly people who use email and browsers and some apps are obviously going to choose the Air, and for them I have a completely different review of the M4 MacBook Air in detail, which actually shows them how to save another $200 if you buy it, so make sure you go check that video out after this if that's you. Now there's the super pro users on the other end, the professional full-time video editors, animators, and users of super intense software like 3D modeling, and those people are always going to go Pro. But there's a really big space in the middle. What if you're a semi-pro user, a user who does a lot of everyday tasks like browsing and watching stuff on their laptop, multitasking, but also does some heavier tasks like coding, compiling, video editing and exporting, and maybe also play some heavy games. Kind of user who has a proper multi-screen setup at home but also works on the go. To all the video editors, freelancers, photographers, movie makers, software developers, startup founders, I'm looking at you. Do you really need the M4 Pro, or are you well covered with the M4 MacBook Air? Well, there's only one way to find out. We have to pick apart each of these 8 differences to see if they're worth it. First, For the processor, let's get the facts straight. The chipset on these laptops is the same chip family. But the big difference that matters in the Pro is that it uses its thicker body to accommodate a fan, which helps cool the processor and reduce thermal throttling of the processor speed so it can actually deliver up to its capability. Now, both the laptops have the M4 chip with 10 CPU cores, but when it comes to GPU cores, the M4 MacBook Air has 8 and the M4 MacBook Pro has 10. Now, if you want, you can get the 10 GPU cores on the Air, but you need to pay another $200 more if you want that. But now that you know the specs, let's talk about what actually mattered in real-life testing on the kind of tasks which you would end up doing, which for most people would be coding and compiling, video editing and exporting, and AI. So first, when it comes to coding and running code builds, the M4 MacBook Air is an absolute beast. Luke Made It's channel has an excellent in-depth analysis of the single core coding performance between the M4 MacBook Air and an M4 MacBook Pro, and you can see right here that they finish almost neck to neck in this test. To make the difference even more stark, on multi-core tests running code builds on the M4 MacBook Air versus a really spec'd out M4 Max chip, the difference still isn't much. He literally took a $3,000 M4 Max laptop in the Pro series and compared it to the M4 MacBook Air, and it was only 28% faster. This laptop costs almost 3 times the M4 MacBook Air at almost $3,000, and the difference isn't much. So I think it's safe to say that the M4 MacBook Air owns this section for its price. Well, if it's good for coders, let's now test if it's good for video editors. Editing works quite well, and you can even keep the timeline resolution at 4K with no lagging, and it's only when you apply any compute heavy effects, like something like magic masking, then the timeline will start to lag a very little bit. So the editing experience on the M4 MacBook Air is actually pretty great. Now, export times are of course going to be different, but interestingly it's not by much. The difference is just 1 to 2 minutes more for each export on the Air versus the Pro. Oh, and also this doesn't cause any overheating when editing on the M4 MacBook Air. It does get a bit warmer than the Pro, but not by much. So if you have it on your lap, you should be okay. Finally, even the onboard AI performance is pretty stellar. You can run a pretty high-powered LLM on your MacBook Air locally and not even approach the RAM limit. You'd really need to push it with more parameters, and when you start hitting 40 billion parameters, you can start to see that it warms up. And look, I know that some of you might be thinking, yeah, this is all good for when I'm on the go, but what about those times when I really need to get stuff done at home, on my desk, apply heavy effects, multitasking different edits? The lack of a fan in the M4 MacBook Air was going to slow me down. Well, yeah, but I found a really interesting solution for you. Max Tech's channel has demoed this really well. He showed that the Cinebench score on the M4 MacBook Air was 30% lower than the Pro, at about 700 for the M4 Air versus about 1000 for the M4 Pro. And this is primarily due to the thermal throttling since there's no fan. But when you add something as simple as an old school laptop cooling pad, which costs what, $15–20? Under that MacBook Air, the score jumps straight up to 800. You can keep improving the score with things like thermal pads and so on. So there's some really simple hacks for when you're at home on your desk and you want to just push this thing a bit more. Now, don't get me wrong, for a really professional video editor trying to run super heavy effects on multiple files in parallel, you will have to be increasingly patient, as will folks running advanced animation and modeling software. For them, the Pro is still the answer, and probably not even the entry-level Pro. You'd want to boost up your specs as well. But for semi-pro users, the processor is actually not that much of an issue, as long as you can be a bit patient. For the average YouTube content creator on a budget, you don't need to get a Pro for video editing. For a budding coder who dailies the MacBook Air, you should be fine. For people using basic 3D modeling applications as well, you should be fine. So if the processor isn't the reason to pay $600 more, is it the screen? Well, the M4 MacBook Air has a Liquid Retina 500 nits LED backlit IPS display with a 60Hz refresh rate. The Pro, on the other hand, has a Liquid Retina XDR display with mini LED backlighting and 1000 nits of sustained brightness, which can go up to 1600 nits when you're watching HDR content. Now look, the screen is definitely much nicer on the M4 Pro. The brightness is very noticeable, especially outside. The 60Hz refresh rate on the M4 Air is something I think most people could live with and not notice it too much. I guess it kind of depends if your current setup has it or not. The 120 of course is going to look much smoother when scrolling or gaming or even editing, but it's not a deal breaker. I do think that this is the one slightly disappointing feature in the M4 MacBook Air this year. At this price point of $1,000, the 120Hz display should be standard. But then again, they even lowered the price this year whilst upping the specs, so I think we're going to have to let Apple off on this one. Now, the brightness is really nice on the Pro, but again, you can live with the MacBook Air's brightness unless you do a lot of work outside in the sun. And unless you insist on putting them side by side, the MacBook Air actually has a pretty good screen. So for most of the semi-pro users, I'm going to go ahead and say that the screen probably still isn't worth the $600. If it was another 50, 100, even 200, maybe you can consider kicking it in. But for $600 less, I think it's okay. Now the third big difference was the ports. The additional SD card and HDMI slot on the Pro is definitely helpful, as is the Thunderbolt on the other side, because it can fit some bigger devices like an external SSD drive, which are a bit hard sometimes on the MacBook Air given the ports are so close by. However, this can all be easily solved with an under $50 dongle like the beautiful Satechi one that I use with my old MacBook Air. So you can get the ports, and hence you shouldn't be paying $600 more. The fourth difference is the battery life, but here again the 18-hour battery on the M4 Air lasts well past a full day and is already way ahead of the industry. Of course, more is better, and the 22 to 24-hour battery on the Pro is even more impressive, but this is like great and really great, so I don't think it's even a factor in my mind. The fifth was the dimensions, and on that one, clearly the Air is winning because it's 30% lighter, it's much thinner, much more portable, and even more than you think, you know. I think that this 13-inch screen size is the right one for most people and makes it much easier for tucking away into smaller bags than it does for the 14-inch MacBook Pro. It's quite hard to stuff that thing into thin bags. And sixth was the speakers, which of course sound way better on the Pro, especially on the bass. But you're not going to have any issues on the MacBook Air watching movies and YouTube, and most editing and coding is done with headphones anyway. The speakers are solid. They're just not bass heavy and pro like the Pro. Seventh was the storage, where the Pro gets a 512 GB SSD in the base model, whilst the Air just gets 256. Again, you can pay $200 more and upgrade to the 512 if you want it. But even with that, it's $1,200 versus $1,600. The other option could be to just use cloud storage and make do with the 256, and or carry a fast external SSD to plug in whenever you need. For semi-pro coders and modelers, it should be okay. But for editors, I think you're going to want to size up to the 512 GB at the bare minimum for the large files. And the eighth difference was the 70-watt charger in the box in the Pro versus the 30 watts with the Air. But you can get this again if you want to pay more. But the Air is very much compatible with the 70 watts, and you can buy it on Apple's website if you want. And given the all-day battery life, the charging speed is not that big of a deal. So where did we land? Should semi-pro users actually buy the MacBook Air instead of the Pro? I think it's a real testament to how good Apple's laptops have gotten this year when I say, yeah, maybe you could. To me, the $999 versus the $1,600 is a steal for the M4 Air. And you always have the option to pay $200 more and spec up the RAM to 24 or 32 or add more storage, which might serve you well based on your needs. The lack of a fan definitely throttles on sustained workloads for a while, but not by too much. And mostly in the end, it's a game of a bit of patience. A couple of minutes more for an export here or there, a little slower compile, but overall we're talking seconds and minutes, not hours. Then there are several hacks like the cooling pad that I mentioned to help you on those high productivity days at home. And then especially if you work a lot on the go at client offices or coffee shops or on the train and so on, the portability of the Air makes it so much more comfortable and seriously preferable to the Pro. And by the way, if you're considering the M4 MacBook Air, then I would definitely watch my in-depth review of that laptop before you make the choice, because there are several hacks to get that cheaper by almost $200. And I also think if you're thinking of an Air, consider the M3 MacBook Air. It's really, really important to figure out what you're going to use it for and whether you need the M4 or the M3 Air, which in some ways is a better deal than the M4, depending on your specific needs. So please don't buy a MacBook before you watch that video. And before you click away, if you like the video, do support a small creator like me by subscribing to the channel and leaving some love in the comments. With all this AI content on YouTube, it's becoming quite hard for small, hardworking creators like me, and so I really value your support. Thanks a lot. I hope you found it useful. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and see you soon.